What would have happened if Teddy Roosevelt had won the election in 1912? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first What If on the Interesting History channel, where we take a look at what if history. Today, I kind of wanted a little bit of a guideline, somewhere to kind of start and look. We chose this book here. It's What If 2, and I actually have the original as well. What If? I'll put links in the description to them for like an Amazon link if you guys want to check that out. Basically, they do what you guys all really ask. What would this happen? And they take uh, historical experts in that field and they have them kind of write up a mock-up of what would have happened. So this one I'm going to do today, Teddy Roosevelt 1912, was written by a man named John Lucas, Lukacs. And I'm going to do just kind of like a brief overview of what he thinks would have happened. So just some actual historical background on the 1912 election itself. Roosevelt had become pretty angry with Howard Taft, who he had picked as his successor for the Republican nomination in 1908 after Roosevelt steps aside. And that's so he runs against, it's a three-party race. Teddy Roosevelt becomes the head of the Bull Moose Party. Taft runs as the Republican, and someone that they never thought would win, Woodrow Wilson, runs as the Democratic candidate. And what actually ends up happening is Roosevelt splits the Republican vote, and Woodrow Wilson gets elected. You know, that's a lot of the reason why you don't see third-party candidates in U.S. politics anymore, because it splits the two major parties' votes. But Teddy Roosevelt could do this because he was a very progressive Republican, so he wasn't actually really liked by the Republicans. It's a really interesting era of history. But John Lucas, I'm going to go with Lucas, just kind of goes through this. So Roosevelt runs through four pieces of legislation: establishment of national income tax, which Woodrow Wilson would enact; direct selection of senators, which up until 1920 wasn't a thing; addition of one of the large Southwest states, namely Arizona or New Mexico would have been territories at this point; a new immigration law, which would set a nearly maximum quota. That kind of sounds current, doesn't it? After Roosevelt gets elected, so we're past this point. Roosevelt is now elected in 1912, which is the what if. He stops the Mexican Revolution in 1913. So what Woodrow Wilson ends up doing is he sends troops into northern Mexico, which almost starts a war. And there's a lot of backstory there. But John has Roosevelt stopping the Mexican Revolution in 1913. He also states that Roosevelt would be appalled by the German invasion of Belgium, but the U.S. would remain neutral. Roosevelt would see war and order a rapid building of the U.S. military and call for volunteers. This would be before war. The U.S. was even in the war, because Roosevelt wouldn't want Germany to control Western Europe, which was also kind of the British fear at the same time. So Roosevelt would go on to win his fourth election in 1916, and he would issue Presidential Order Number 1, which would order ships into the North Atlantic to protect merchant shipping, something that Woodrow Wilson didn't do. And Roosevelt would also publish and send to the three major powers of Europe something called the Roosevelt Corollary, which would be a cessation of all hostilities in Europe, a return of all armies to the state frontiers, so basically their own borders, and a 3-month truce with a peace treaty coming out of The Hague. At first, the only power that doesn't agree to these terms is Germany. Obviously, Germany's the one that's taken all this land. All the other ones are just hoping to kind of stop the German tide. Since Germany doesn't accept the Roosevelt Corollary, Theodore Roosevelt goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war, which they thoroughly accept. Since draft bill, or Teddy Roosevelt calling for volunteers in 1914, was passed earlier, the U.S. Army is ready and prepared for the war. Due to this, they're able to participate in early 1917 as opposed to late 1917. And they're well trained. They're not novices, which results in really strong U.S. offensives in early 1917 and an armistice being signed in 1917, 3 years to the day after Britain declared on Germany. A peace treaty would be signed where Alsace-Lorraine would be returned to France, and the author still has the Russian Revolution occurring in that same year, but due to Roosevelt's backing, a government is reestablished after the revolution, still with the Romanov dynasty. They managed to grab, what is his name, first name? Well, they grabbed Trotsky, trying to flee Canada to Russia. The Swiss grab Lenin, and Stalin becomes a part of the Russian Secret Service. Now, there was more kind of in between here. He kept the same date of Roosevelt's death, which was 1919. Now, he kind of went with the idea of Roosevelt the diplomat. So Teddy Roosevelt wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905 for negotiating a deal to the Russo-Japanese War. But really, when you look back at Teddy Roosevelt, he's mostly known for strong arm politics, not necessarily as a negotiator. You know, his policy was speak softly but carry a big stick. Here's how I kind of think it would have went. If he's elected in 1912, I think you see the U.S. probably enter the war before 1916. He wouldn't have put up with German ships sinking American vessels. That wouldn't have been something that he would have put up with. And one of the more interesting aspects that I think would have happened is you wouldn't have had the Alien and Sedition Act being passed during World War I, which Woodrow Wilson passed. There's a lot of W's there, guys. I'm sorry. Which is a big time problem in the U.S. today, the Alien and Sedition Act. If you've never heard of it, go look it up. The police use it a lot these days. I don't think that the war would have ended any sooner. So if the U.S. enters the war in 1914, 1915, 1916, they still have to develop and learn the ways of war. But maybe the increased manpower means that Germany gets pushed back and the war still ends in 1917. You obviously would have seen more U.S. loss of life, which probably means more isolation after the war. The author of the chapter itself did have the Republicans taking the next two elections, so the 1920 and the 1924 elections, which is pretty interesting. Let's see, Woodrow Wilson wins 1912, 1916, loses, I think the Republicans take 1920. But I think the real gist that you can get out of the what if of Roosevelt winning the election in 1912 is I think you also see an aspect of third-party politics becoming more of the norm in the United States. Obviously, Roosevelt creates his own party so that he can run against the Republicans, leading to more awareness and more acceptability of a third party, which is still something that the U.S. struggles with today. I think you have the U.S. enter the war, and I think you have a strong Roosevelt to probably negotiate a peace similar to what the historian that wrote the article states. And I think he probably still does die. Like he's very unhealthy during the time of the First World War. And if you can imagine the war stress on top of that, I think the author choosing for him to die in 1919 is also very much a possibility. That's all I have for you guys here. If you have a different what if that you would like to see, some of them I will try to go a little bit more in depth with. I want to try to keep the videos around 10 minutes. But if there's one that I'm particularly interested with or can maybe see different aspects, we'll take a look at that. What do you think? Maybe you have a different idea of what would have happened if Teddy Roosevelt would have won the election in 1912. Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.